Today, Open Source Security is talking to Vlad Harbuz. He works on the Open Source Pledge and Open Source Sustainability. I am very excited for this one because I feel like Vlad has a lot he's going to teach us. So Vlad, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Josh. Thank you for making time to have me on. I really appreciate it.
So, I mean, it's your show kind of, where do you want to start?
I'd love to talk about the pledge. I think it might be interesting to talk about what my journey was getting started working on the pledge.
For sure.
Just because especially I think it's interesting how so often we think of open source as a technical thing, and it is very much a technical thing, but it's also hugely a philosophical and like social thing, and I really get excited to talk about that. So basically my story is I ran this software company that I started with my friend a very long time ago. It's called Saffron, and we ran it for something like 10 years. And it really highlighted for me the sort of interdependency of collaborating on software, because we ran the company. It was fine for like 6 or 7 years. And then things started to get a bit weird for me personally, because in the last few years of running this company, I noticed that in what I guess it would be like for someone else a capitalist success story, I was basically doing nothing. Like, not basically, I was doing literally nothing.
Nice.
During COVID, I was at home. I was playing like video games on my PlayStation with my wife, and I was getting paid a bunch of money.
Amazing.
For all of the work that everyone else was doing, right? And obviously, I don't want to every company and work arrangement is different and so on. But for me, I just got to the point where it felt like something was wrong, right? And it felt like there was, I was basically getting a bunch of money off of what other people were doing exclusively, right? Without me contributing. So at that point, I decided to shut down the company and start thinking about the sort of philosophical and social aspects of software. And I started doing a philosophy degree to think about this. I'm doing a philosophy PhD now, which I'm hoping to make it about the ethics of open source. But what ended up happening one day was I was on Mastodon, as I often am, and I saw Tim Perry from HTTP Toolkit say something like, "Oh, we should do like 1% for the environment or whatever, but for open source, right? Like 1% for supporting open source maintainers." And I was like, "That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so Tim got back to me like a couple of weeks later, and he was like, I did some research. It looks like Sentry is doing this. It's called, at that point, it was the OSS pledge. And it wasn't sort of yet launched. And Chad Whitaker, who has been working on open source sustainability for so long and who I really cherish and I love working with, he's an amazing guy, was working on this. And so I decided, okay, like this really, to me, put into focus this frustration that I had, where we as software developers, and me as in a sort of more for-profit world, but also generally in open source, we don't quite acknowledge how much we depend on other people's work, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe I should also talk about what the open source pledge is. So the idea is it's this initiative where we try to get companies to pay any open source maintainers really, but we generally recommend that they pay the open source maintainers that their products depend on. And the ask is to pay $2,000 per full-time equivalent developer that they employ per year. And it has to be to projects meeting the open source definition or to open source foundations. The idea there is that companies certainly give a lot to open source developers in other ways. So, gifts in kind, cloud credits or whatever. But it's really difficult to make open source development sustainable if you can't pay rent. And
yes,
we can talk about what the best way to do that is. And, there's a lot of people like Mike McQuaid that question, like, what's the best way to, sometimes paying maintainers can have bad results, right? And I'm open to all of those conversations, but I think at the end of the day, it's inescapable that we need the people who build the software that we rely on every day to be able to make a living.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this has been kind of a long-running theme on this podcast that comes up on a regular basis, is like, there are many problems in the open source world, and money is definitely a big one for open source maintainers. And so, okay, I have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to break this apart into pieces, but let's just start with like the actual mechanics. Saying company, you should pay $2,000 per developer to open source. Like there's a lot of moving parts in that. It sounds simple in theory, but it's actually, as a company, it can be difficult to actually like pay a person money, right? And also if you have to split this apart, how do we, carve up this money we're going to give to maintainers? So I'm curious how open source pledge handles, helping with those mechanics for a company.
It's a great question. So, we don't mandate anything, so we're happy for companies to choose whatever works for them. One thing that we started out with was obviously GitHub sponsors historically has been a big channel that companies use to pay developers. It has a few limitations. One limitation is that, I've also seen that a lot of GitHub sponsors usage is maintainers paying each other. So for example,
Yeah.
I know people where like, A is paying B, paying C, paying A. And so nothing ends up happening except you're just ending up paying fees for the payment processing, which is not ideal. Another thing is, I don't know for sure, but my impression is that GitHub has not been investing as much effort into developing GitHub sponsors recently as I personally think would be really cool. So I do hope that they can do that in the future. But for us, a big limitation was just the API, right? So it's not even trivial to get a list of your own payments, right? So I tried to develop some tools to make that work, where I tried to infer from other results of other API calls what your payments must have been. Mixed results, right? The best thing that we recommend is thanks.dev, which is the service which companies can use to, you basically give thanks.dev access to your repos, and this is sort of in confidentiality. Thanks.dev scans all of those dependency trees that you rely on. There's a certain weighting that happens that you can customize, and based on that, you can get a decent picture. It tries to connect it to people. It sort of reserves the funds for maintainers to claim. It's the best system we have. Obviously, it has some limitations, and it will also miss a lot of important dependencies. So I just saw Daniel Stenberg recently post about how, I don't know if it was a GitHub service or whatever, I think it was a GitHub dependency, how many projects depend on da-da-da. It's how many projects depend on curl, and it was like 50.
Yes. No, that was a Linux Foundation report, I believe.
Oh, Linux Foundation. Okay.
There's Scorecard or Insights or one of those projects. Yes, which is hilarious, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't have the numbers, but I'm pretty sure it's more than 50. So, and bit. then you have, binary dependencies, which I've spoken about recently, which is another thing where we just, if you're using Python, it's not really trivial to even find to reliably identify that you depend on C or Rust libraries, let alone to find the people that wrote those libraries, let alone to then pay them.
For sure. So that's a FOSDEM talk you gave. I think it was this year. And I'll put a link in the show notes to that. But yeah, you basically talk about the fact that like if you run it, and I'll pick on, I work for a company called Anchor. We have an SBOM scanner called Sift. If you run Sift, it's going to tell you have this Python package installed. But inside of that Python wheel, there could be curl, for example. But we're not necessarily going to find that because we're only going to tell you about the Python package installed. And this happens to a lot of Python packages where there are just binaries all the way down to make some of this stuff work.
Yeah, and ultimately, basically, when you install the Python package, the native, the binary dependency, the C library or whatever, needs to be somewhere, right? Ideally, you would manage it with something like your system's package manager that is more well equipped to find and download, those things.
Yeah.
Practically, what ends up happening is we don't unfortunately have tools, and this is something that I'm trying to develop. I'm also, and we can talk about this in the future, I'm working on starting a nonprofit that is based around open source sustainability research, so bringing together researchers that work on exactly this kind of
Nice.
thing, and yeah, to see what we can do together as opposed to just sort of doing little bits separately. But what ends up happening basically is because there are no good tools for interoperation in between, say, pip or UV and the system package manager, what people do, and I don't blame them, is they compile the native library, however, and then they just put it inside the wheel. But then
Yeah.
as a consumer of that package, I can't really know where that build came from. And so there you end up with a security issue where it's difficult to trace the provenance of or even identify all of the things that you depend on. So what my strategy has been to basically download every wheel or the most popular wheels, look at dynamic libraries contained within those wheels, and based on the information in the ELF files, identify, oh, it looks like you depend on this library.
Which is really hard to do.
Yeah,
Like
you'd
really
think,
hard.
yeah, yeah, you'd think. I was thinking like, well, look, the dynamic linker uses that information to find it on your file system when you compile the thing. So you would think that there's information in there to reliably, you have the name and you can find, based on the name, you can identify the package. But there's all sorts of problems. For one thing, different things are called different names in different places. And, there's, you can do package URLs. And when you do package URLs, that incorporates, you're referring to not only the package, but also the channel that you got it from. And then you have
Yep.
the same package, which is two different. So it's like, this is kind of my thing right now, is I'm trying to just convey to people just how much work still needs to be done to develop tools for us to be able to more reliably work with these huge dependency chains
Yes.
that are increasingly getting out of hand. For one thing, because, for security reasons, which I'm sure you know more about than I do when it comes to just the ramifications that, maybe if that native library has a vulnerability, how am I going to know? I depend on it, but I don't know about it. I can't even figure out that I depend on it, let alone that there's a vulnerability in
Yeah.
there. But then also from the financial sustainability perspective, right? Like, have you seen, so we published this on the Open Source Pledge blog, got shared on socials as well. Miranda Heath wrote a report on burnout in open source.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think it really, a lot of people really, it was a powerful thing for a lot of people just because of, I think, especially some of the quotes in there, where you see how much people are struggling with balancing what the community expects of them, what they can realistically do in a financially responsible way, balancing it with their day job, and yeah, we've seen a lot of cases of burnout.
Yeah.
Which, in addition to just being a sad thing to happen to these people that we care about, it just means that this technology that we rely on maybe just is not stably maintained.
Yes. Yes. I know exactly what you're talking about. And so this is such a weird problem. So there's a friend who's been on the show multiple times. His name is Thomas DePierre. And he's the guy who wrote the I Am Not a Supplier blog, like way back in
Right,
the
yeah.
Log4j days. Like I love talking to Thomas because he always like sets me straight, I feel like, where I'm not understanding something necessarily correctly. And like he's an example of someone who has some fairly popular packages that he maintains, but not as his job. And so he has like a week, a month, or I'm sorry, like maybe a weekend a month, maybe, probably not even that, to work on this stuff, right? And he talked about the fact that like giving him a couple $1,000s doesn't help him in any meaningful way, because what he actually needs is more time, right? Not thousands of dollars. Like unless you could employ him full time, and he's admitted like the packages he maintains are probably not like full-time jobs, but unless he was given enough money to literally quit his day job and do this as his job, like no amount of money is going to help get bugs fixed faster, because what he needs is time, right? And like that's a perfect example of where like the burnout is real, because these people now are, you have people complaining. You get like, I mean, one of my favorites is, like looking at some open source projects that I help with, you'll see people file bugs like in every 3 days. They're like, what's the status of this? It's super important. It's like, well, the status is nothing's going to happen for a long time. And you
Yeah.
bugging me is actually going to make it worse. So like, just stop and be patient, or write me a patch and send it along. And then maybe we can talk. Right.
Yeah, and it might be that there's no one size fits all. So I think for me with the open source pledge, I try to advocate for maintainers getting paid, and I think that
Yeah.
there needs to be someone to advocate for that, and I think that's an important thing. Do I think that's
Yes.
100% of the solution? Probably not, right? I think there's also a big question about like how employers want to treat the importance of
Yes.
contributing back to open source, which I know that for a lot of companies does happen, but how can we make that be a sort of universally acknowledged thing? And how the other thing is, um, I remembered the this Tailwind AI thing that happened a couple months back, I think, where Adam from Tailwind was saying that like their business model was kind of failing because people are
Yes.
consuming their documentation through LLMs and not directly, which means that people can't see their paid offerings and so on. Without necessarily making a comment on what the best thing is there to do, because I just don't know. What is interesting to me is a lot of the time, it's really just not visible. Like it's difficult to translate a supply chain relationship into a human relationship, and so often we should. So for example, I maintain MPLD3, which is a package that I didn't create, I inherited basically, and it's in the top 1% most downloaded Python packages.
Wow.
I really struggle to find time to maintain that, and I always feel awkward on the issue tracker because I'm like, I'm doing my best, I'm gonna, and it's small, isn't even, it's not even a lot of development work. It's just, reviewing, making sure that this pull request that I've gotten is well tested and that I trust that, it's going to be okay. I don't know who uses MPLB3. Like, I just have no idea. And you would think it's in the 1% most popular Python packages. You would think that there would be some way to find out, or but I just, for all I know, any number of companies could be using it. It might be really important to them. They might even say like, hey, we'll pay for you or for someone else, or we'll work on it or whatever. But it's just hard to connect to the people on the other side of the supply chain.
Yes, 100%. Well, it can even get weird because, I mean, look at the whole XZ incident.
Yeah.
Every open source maintainer is like super on edge now of like, who is this person? Can I trust them?
Yeah.
Is this patch okay? Like, I don't know. I mean, I see this all the time where like the projects, my company has that are public, like we get a pull request and it's like, this looks weird. Like, is this North Korea? Like, what's going on? And that's like where we immediately jump of, I don't know if I can trust this person. I have no idea what's going on, which is also like super mentally straining on the developers, right?
For sure. I actually was wondering, so I have a question for you. In your security work, do you come across instances where, I mean, XZ I think is a particularly visible example of burnout related to, or vulnerabilities that, the origin of the vulnerabilities is related to burnout. But in your work, do you often come across security problems where it's identifiable that the maintainer is burnt out or has disappeared, or like there's a human element there that's sort of causing a security problem?
So this is something we talk about at work all the time. And I've discussed this with more people than I can count. And I'm very hesitant to try to do this work. And the reason being that trying to look at, like, we don't know what the signals are yet to kind of identify some of this right there. If someone says I'm burnt out, I'm not doing this, obviously that's a pretty good signal. But looking at like open source repositories and saying, okay, this developer suddenly stopped doing work for a month. Like what's going, have they been taken over by a bot? Are they sick? Did their kid get hurt? There's like a million things. And so I think like when you talk about the human angle, right, it's really hard to look at some of this data and be able to make anything resembling a reasonable decision. Right? Because saying, oh, this person has been compromised, suddenly their time zone is shifted from, European Central to whatever time zone Beijing is in or something. Like, is it? Did they, I don't know. And so I'm always kind of critical of a lot of the projects that claim they can do this, because I think what you're actually doing is you're dehumanizing the developer, and then you're going to throw something in their face that's like, oh, your project is untrustworthy now because you haven't, committed anything in 2 months. And it's like, I've been with my kid who's in the hospital,
Yeah.
you jackass. And so now you've made things even worse, right? And so like, this is such a difficult problem, and I don't have a good answer for it.
For sure. That totally makes sense. And like one thing that I'm looking forward to is so a year, 2 years ago, I think there was this GitHub issue that is one of my favorite GitHub issues. It's github.com/chadwhittaker/openpath/issues/20. It's OpenPath issue 20, and it's called Better Defined Success. And there, Chad's talking about how many um, critical, or as I prefer to call them, keystone, to use Nadia Iqbal's terminology, keystone maintainers are there that build most of the stuff that we rely on. And Andrew Nesbitt gave it a go, and there's some very interesting numbers in that issue. And basically, what he ended up with is a number, something like 4,000 maintainers are responsible for something like 80% of the dependencies that we rely on.
Wow.
Which is fascinating because it makes you wonder, who are those guys, right? Like, can we talk to them? Can we find out more? And so Miranda Heath, after doing the burnout report, now is looking at doing research into, well, can we identify some of those people? And also, what are their stories, right? Like, can we talk to the person and figure out, do you need to get paid? Do you want to get paid? Are you unemployed? Are you working at a software company? Are you doing this open source maintenance as a second shift after work, and so on? Because it's just difficult to, there's such like a human element here that we just don't quite hear about. And yeah, so this is something that Miranda's going to be doing, and I'm very excited to see the results. And yeah,
It's
it's
amazing.
something that Sentry is supporting as part of the open source pledge, which is really awesome.
I love this. This is perfect. I mean, my example I'll give to you is, so at the OpenSSF some time ago, this is several years now, I was on their technical advisory committee, and an issue someone filed was like, what is the correct number of maintainers an open source project should have? And I've taken all of Andrew's ecosystems data. In fact, Andrew was on the show not long ago. I've taken all his data, and I do all kinds of wacky stuff with it, right? Just because I think it's fascinating to look at. And if you look at the data, like the number of projects that have one maintainer is a frightening number of projects. Like, it is absolutely bananas. Now, granted, a lot of those are like, I've uploaded a thing to NPM and I will never use it ever again or look at it and no one else uses it sort of projects. But I remember I showed these graphs to a bunch of like OpenSSF people. And OpenSSF, you think Open Source Security Foundation, like these people should understand this. And they're like, oh, that's just NPM. Everything else is fine. So I pulled in the Python data. I'm like, look, the graphs look the same. It's just, magnitudes are a little different. And like, oh, no, it's fine. And I kept showing ecosystems. I'm like, this is the data. And like, there were still some of them who were like, I don't believe that. I'm like, I don't even know what to say to this. There's like such a disconnect, I think, sometimes between like how this all works and how people think it works, which is, I mean, thank goodness you guys are going to do some research on that, because we desperately need it.
Yeah, and not to make it even more scary, but I think a huge part is also just project governance, right? So I think one thing that to me stood out, or that to me showed the importance of governance structures, is I remembered this WordPress drama that happened a couple of years back.
Oh,
I
yes.
spoke about it at a conference at one point, where WordPress is open source, right? But if Matt Mullenweg controls the infrastructure that you need to use the open source stuff, it's still controlled by one guy.
Yeah.
It's not like you get the benefits of like collective governance because it's open source. It's like, we need more than just open source, because open source is describing the source code, right? Which is awesome, and I love that. But we need a bit more than that. And it could be the case that you could look at a project, look at the data, and you see, oh, it's 10 people that have push access to this. That's better, and so that's why we think of the quote-unquote buzz factor sometimes. But I think that sort of leaves a lot of important information out, because what is the governance there? Is it the case that 10 people have push access, but just because of the norms of the project, it's really just the one guy. A lot of people can have access, but you can have a situation where, because one person is more trusted or just has done it more or is intimidating or I don't know, is the person that ends up making all the decisions. And to be, I'm really sympathetic to open source projects in this respect, because we just don't have good guides, good tools, good blueprints for here's how you can set up your project in a
Yeah.
sustainable way. Here's a sustainable way to do governance, which is why I was really impressed by NPMX, if you've seen
I
that
don't know what
project.
their governance structure is, but I mean, I know of NPMX.
Yeah. Well, in any case, without saying that that's the best governance structure or something, I was really impressed how a couple of weeks, literally 2 weeks after the project got started, they had, I don't know, 10, 15 maintainers that had access to the project and were actively involved and so on. And I think it's really part of why the project became so popular, because it was able to receive input and control from all of these really knowledgeable people, because there was not that fear of, oh, if I give you push access, who knows, can I really trust you?
Yeah.
It's sort of making that leap of faith to say, we need to collaborate on this and to have this shared governance. Otherwise, we're going to end up in this BDFL sad place, right? And where the project is vulnerable, and then what have we accomplished?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, but also there are plenty of open source projects that will only be one person. And so like, what
Yeah.
do we do about those? How do we
Yeah.
make sure, when that person gets sick or gets hit by a bus? I mean, so I have a project I maintain called ULARN, which is an old like dungeon crawler, terminal thing. The author of that, the original author, is literally dead, right?
Oh,
Like this happens, and we
yeah.
have no idea what to do about it in many instances.
And I was particularly worried to see a jazz band shutting down, if you saw those news as well.
Yes.
Which was intended, in my understanding, as a kind of project where people can come together and share maintenance and governance
Yep.
over exactly, those kinds of projects that are small or maybe abandoned or maybe don't have full-time maintainership. And it ended up that basically it was just one person that was
I'm shocked to learn
the sort
this.
of meta maintainer of all of these projects.
Yeah.
And it just was not able to progress beyond that. And so now I think the projects were transferred to some other organization, but it just, I think, highlights even more how much we need to do research into this stuff to be like, okay, what
Yeah.
happened there? Why did it fail? How can we do it better next time? Otherwise, we're going to end up with all of this technology that we rely on that is ambiguously controlled,
Yeah.
which scares me.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. 100%. And I mean, yeah, jazz band was like, I understand why. Without question, I don't blame anyone for that, but it's a great example of how a lot of this happens, where I think it's like trickle down, right? Where everything lands on one person eventually in a lot of these projects. And then there's maintainer guilt, right? Where people feel like I have to do these things because people are counting on me. And like, I always tell open source people, like, you owe no one anything. Like, do not feel bad saying no or going to the park with your kid. Like, that is way more valuable than feeling guilt and wasting your weekend on bugs from someone that has no idea who you are and doesn't care who you are.
Yeah, I actually have Miranda's burnout report on my second monitor here, and it's just, there's so many quotes that are really moving, and just
Yeah.
one that I'm looking at from Ashley Williams. I was doing nights and weekends. It was wrecking my health, and I was just devastated. So after a while, enough issue follow-ups, like, is this maintained? Are you going to fix my issue? I had to say that I had to give up. And this is especially apparent when you sort of put together the sense of entitlement that some people sometimes have
Yes.
when it comes to why aren't you, because we are so accustomed, and again, I understand the impulse, but it's not a good one. We're so accustomed to sort of buying a product that we don't have this expectation of, well, the product is faulty. I'm the customer. You need to fix it for me, which is just another way that, we approach it with this market mentality, both sort of psychological and economical. And that's its own sphere, but this is not the sphere that we're working with in open source.
Yeah.
And you get all of that pressure while at the same time thinking, okay, but what is, for me, my family, what is financially irresponsible? How much dedication to triaging 500 issues is going to take away from my time that, that I can use to focus on my paying job so I can pay my bills, right? That's tough. That's just a difficult position.
For sure. Okay, Vlad. So let's start to land this plane. So
Okay.
I know we've talked a lot about many of the challenges, and I will definitely have you
Yeah.
back because this is a conversation that could go on for an infinite number of hours. Which is,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
that's
so.
good and bad. It's interesting and fascinating. But so you work with Open Source Pledge, and Open Source Pledge is meant to kind of start solving some of these problems, or at least understanding them. Maybe we'll say, not necessarily solving them. But if I am a listener and this sounds like something I want to learn more about and something I should really think about kind of doing with my organization, like how do you suggest like getting started? Because obviously if I'm a developer and I go to my leadership and say, hey, we should give $2,000 per developer to open source projects, they're going to be like, get out of here, hippie. This is ridiculous. So like, what does this journey look like?
Well, I think I would say to those companies that it also is in their interest to pay the maintainers they depend on.
Yeah.
There's a few reasons. One reason is just you want to make sure that the stuff you rely on keeps working. I understand that it looks like it's going to keep working and we're taking it for granted. I think there's good reason to be a little bit worried about whether it's going to keep
A
working.
lot
And I
worried.
think and I think that one really impactful thing that companies can do is pay the maintainers. And of course, there's still, that doesn't finish, it's not a complete solution, but I think it's a thing that needs to happen one way or another. Other than that, we've heard from, well, for one thing, our responsibility is, the pledge team is we try to promote these companies and their work in supporting open source. And so we've done promotional campaigns in Times Square where we put all the company logos up and we said, we were celebrating these companies today. And this is, I think, something that our members appreciate and it's useful for them. And then I've seen people on Blue Sky say, I applied for a job at such and such company and got the job. And part of the reason why I chose that company is because they were members of the pledge, because I want to work for a company that I
Nice.
know cares about open source just the way that I do. And so I think those are a few of the real benefits to joining the pledge. I also think that, it's also companies can show a sort of thought leadership role by joining the pledge, right? You can show customers like, hey, we're ahead of the game, right? And I understand that it's difficult to identify the people and so on. I think a lot of companies take advantage of their in-house talent and the developers know through their experience what software is being used and what is most important. At the same time, I would say if companies want to talk about that, need any kind of help, they can, if you go on opensourcepledge.com, we have contact details and we're very happy to talk about that and make suggestions and we're always happy to chat.
Awesome. So let me ask then, kind of what's your angle? Because if I'm a company, you're saying the company's going to pay the developers directly. So how is Open Source Pledge like sustaining itself then to keep this going?
Great question. So we don't touch any of the money. It goes directly to the developers.
Right,
The open
right.
source pledge. So my work on the pledge is funded by Sentry, and I'm very grateful to Sentry for enabling me to do that work. I would love in the long term, and this is also part of why I'm working on this nonprofit that other people like Andrew Nesbitt are also a part of and that I'd love to talk to you about in the future, where we can find a place to do this independently as its own organization, because I think it's awesome that Sentry's paying for this. Wouldn't it be nice, though, if in the long term we could have these kinds of initiatives just be supported by tech companies more generally, right? Like in the same way that it's kind of funny. It's kind of a catch-22, right? It's like, how do we make sure that open source projects are sustainable? We need to build tools for that. We need to do work to understand and research and ensure that. Well, who's going to fund that work? And so we end up in situations which I've seen, with a lot of open source sustainability tools, where the makers of the tools can't get funding.
Yes.
And it's like, well, okay, well, it's kind of ironic, right? Like the open source sustainability technology is unsustainable.
I know, right?
So, yeah.
And this was a topic I talked to Michael Windsor from Alpha Omega about a bunch of this a couple episodes ago. And like, this is one of the things he talked about is, in all these like package ecosystems, they're basically barely paying their bills. So yeah, like building tools to do kind of the next thing to help with this kind of stuff. Like there's no resources for it at all. And these are things that could definitely have an impact. So I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's tough, man.
So this is not, me or anyone trying to make a profit or anything like that. This is just saying it's in everyone's interest, right? All of us who use open source, it's in our collective interest to make sure that it keeps working, and let's
Yes.
come together to support that financially and with our time and research.
I mean, what did Harvard say? Like $8 trillion or some ungodly amount of money that open source is worth?
Yeah.
Like,
The estimate is very funny. Chad loves to. It's a bit of a pet peeve. He always, when people bring that up, he's like, "No, it's impossible." Which I think is probably right. I think it's an overinflated number because it assumes that every company the replacement cost that every company would replace the same software separately. But even if you divide that by whatever integer you want, it's a lot, right? It's a lot. Yeah.
It's a big number. 100%. Yes. Yeah. All right, Vlad, take us home. Let us know whatever you want us to know and kind of the next steps for everyone listening.
What I would say is, if you want to know more about the challenges that maintainers face, read Miranda Heap's Burnout Report. It's on the Open Source Pledge blog. The report is hosted on, the full report is on her website. We have a blog post that summarizes it. And I honestly just want to give a shout out to people like Chad Whitaker and Andrew Nesbitt, who have done so much for so long that is acknowledged by people, but I want to do more to acknowledge it, because they have done so much work. They have taught me so much that enables me to do all this work. And yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to them.
100%. It always fascinates me that there are Morlocks of open source that almost no one knows about, but the things they do are absolutely amazing. Yeah. And those guys are definitely on my list.
And companies, join the pledge, opensourcepledge.com. Always happy to talk. Any questions?
Yes.
We'll schedule a call.
And links in the show notes for anyone listening. So go hit them up and I'll have links to all this stuff. But Vlad, thank you so much. This has been an amazing discussion. I cannot wait to have you back.
Thank you so much, Josh.